Hello and welcome to a special YouTube presentation from the In the Money Media Network. This is part of our expanded Kentucky Derby coverage. We are taking a deep dive into the Kentucky Derby preps through the lens of ThoroPACE, a groundbreaking new pace prediction product. You're going to hear all about that, as well as our analysis of the preps. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatow. Not with you in the bunker. I'm up here in the Brooklyn salon, upstairs, kicked out of my own office. Long story, but very eager to have this conversation with a man you might know from the fantastic work he does over at ThoroPACE and the great work he does right with us via In the Money Plus. And his name is Tyler Wisman. Tyler, what's going on?
Not too much, Pete. Getting ready for Derby.
I see you repping the Big Blue Nation. We appreciate that over here.
Always.
Inextricable with Kentucky horse racing. Where shall we begin our conversation today, my friend?
So I wrote a piece on ThoroPACE, just looking at the recaps through the lens of pace, right? And I think even the loyal listeners, if you will, should be somewhat familiar with ThoroPACE at this point. You've been kind enough to have us on a couple of times now, but I think even those that just tune in a few times a year and maybe watching this, trying to get some insight into the Kentucky Derby, probably get a good sense as to, if you watched the Derby last year, pace certainly can make the race and did last year. So I think with that in mind, let's look through some of the prep races, some of the more important ones, kind of focusing on that last round, right? And I think probably a fairly good place to start is with that February 25th Rebel, right, where Confidence Game got it done. And just to orient listeners, right, like what we do is we assign a forecast, right, to each race, and then also a pace figure once the race is actually run. Our scale is minus 35. And if it's a minus 35, that would theoretically feature or favor rather speed horses, right? So again, kind of easy lead. So you're going to get a good setup if you're on the lead. Therefore, you should be expected to perform well. Conversely, the other end of the spectrum is a plus 35, right? So it's a 70-point scale. So that plus 35, which you can't see in the header here, if you will, but it's just to the right of the horse's name. That will indicate, if it's a plus 35, that it would be much more favorable to stretch runners or closers, if that's how you prefer to refer them to. This may be a little bit difficult to see, but definitely we'll link to the write-up, and they're going to send a note out to the In the Money email subscribers. So inthemoneypodcast.com/email if you're not already on that list. But nevertheless, let's start with Confidence Game, right? So the Rebel fast-paced race, plus 28. This horse, as you can see, was in fifth position early, so several links off the pace, 6.5 links back at the first point of call. So basically got a setup. The other thing that you'll notice is most of the horses that are considered, the front runners, if you will, or not necessarily front runners, but the more favorable horses have run twice since he's ran. So he's got a couple of things in my mind against him. He's actually going to be kind of a downgrade on that last race. So even though he got the job done, he's unlikely to get, and we'll talk about this in a minute, he's unlikely to get the same setup in the Derby, right? And so with that, Confidence Game would be a downgrade for multiple reasons, not the least of which is he got a setup that he is unlikely to get in the Derby.
I think that's a good description. And yeah, folks can see those key numbers that Tyler was running through here. This key, and I'm trying to circle it. I'm not sure if that's working. Okay. The 28, all, very much a track that was favoring closers. This number next to the 28, fifth early, and then 6.5. That's the links back at just the first call. Is that right, Tyler?
Exactly, yeah, and we do have this for other calls as well. And I think that it's just as important, right? Not necessarily the position, but the more important thing is how many links he was off of the leader, if you will. And in this case, definitely several links back. So, a pace situation that flattered his running style. He got the job done, and that's great. But again, perhaps unlikely to get that same setup and off a very extended layoff, in relative to the other runners.
One thing that strikes me just looking through this last round of preps quickly, and you can guide us wherever you want us to go, Tyler, but it does seem like a lot of horses definitely were with the flow, as we like to say here, in one direction or another, with some exceptions. But just looking at the Raise Cane effort, this was almost as closer friendly as it could have been. Pretty closer friendly flow for him to run into. looking at the Battaglia, certainly that's the case. 35, again, a race where, statistically, I think this pretty much means that less than 5% of the time you're going to see a horse be able to front run and win. And again, closers were coming in. Even a fancied runner like Tapit Trice in his run in the Tampa Bay Derby looks like it was very much earned with the flow. So at that point in the Derby standings, it's hard to get too much of a grip on a horse that, maybe had a little bit more improvement to come, because a lot of those figures were earned with the flow of the race in their favor.
Correct. Yeah. And I think Tapit Trice is kind of interesting, right? Like, figures to get a lot of support at the windows, and deservedly so. If you look at the Tampa Bay Derby, to your point, like, a plus 25, he was 11th, basically dead last, 9 lengths behind the leader early, got the job done, really kind of in hand, if you will. But then you fast forward to the Bluegrass, and the horse clearly, in my mind, took a step forward on a number of different, aspects of his racing style. But he did get out of the gate a little quicker, but was still 7th early and 8 lengths back. Now, that the Bluegrass had a minus 14, right? So theoretically, that skews towards favoring speed horses. And with that, where he was early, he overcame, if you will, the flow. Obviously, it's well documented that Verifying was pretty game in the stretch, but was much more forward relative to Tapit Trice. So on pace alone, one might think, well, Tapit Trice was clearly the better horse. And I don't think many people were arguing that. Now, that being said, I'm not one that wants to necessarily, on the basis of that alone, toss Verifying, because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, when we project what is the pace of the upcoming race, Verifying, in my mind, projects to get a very forward trip. He's actually, we just learned that Jace's Road will get into the Derby, and I don't have an updated forecast. But that said, and we can talk about the Japanese horses as well. But right now, of the American contingent, one that we have data for, we would have Verifying on the lead, which may be unique to our product. But I also think that there are plenty of examples in recent history, if authentic Medina Spirit, where, ThoroPACE is one aspect of my handicapping. I also use the Thoro graph sheets, which factor in ground loss, where there's actually, a series of 3 derbies in a row, 2020, 21, or 2019, 2020, and 2021, I think that the winner of the race actually did not get the best thorograph figure, right? And that's obviously factoring in ground loss. So, in a race where trips are going to be very important, Verifying will be forward. I could see Tapit Trice running a better, if you will, thorograph figure, but not actually winning the race. So again, I'm still pretty high myself on Verifying, despite him getting a favorable setup. I think he just met a really good horse, and that really good horse figures to get a much more difficult trip in the Kentucky Derby.
We will get to that pace projection in a minute. There's some other stuff I wanted to show. Do we need this visual anymore, Tyler, or should I bring them along to show them how they can get more information from ThoroPACE?
Yeah, I think let's talk through just a couple more spots here that I think to put a finer point on, right? Like, so Kingsbarns, right, in the Louisiana Derby, I think it's pretty well documented that this horse was, able to set an easy lead, got the job done. And if you look in the far right column on the thing that you see here, it's really, as basically the last 2/3 of preps, it's the only horse that won in wire-to-wire fashion. Again, with the exception being that we don't have the UAE Derby on this. So with that being said, that kind of is an indicator as to why people are saying the Kentucky Derby this year might be a relatively paceless race. So with Kingsbarns, yes, he got the job done. It was a minus 26, so definitely flattered the style that he invoked that day. Again, another horse that on the surface, and if I'm using my own product, if you will, I should completely dismiss. I don't think that the horse can win, but there is something about him that says, if he's forward and he just runs the race that he ran, like he doesn't necessarily have to be on the lead, but might actually be able to work a good trip. I don't think I would ever use the horses from a win in, but I do think it's difficult to toss from the lower runs of exotics. The other reason that I want to talk about the Louisiana Derby is, and I'll actually kind of speak to a few races, right? So if you look at the Risen Star, the Louisiana Derby, and the Bluegrass, one of the things that you're going to see, and actually, the last two being more severe, is there's a horse that comes out of all 3 of those races that is a dead closer, and that is Sun Thunder. That horse in its last 2 races has just not got any pace at all to close into. Despite the Derby not being, a supersonic pace, at least expected as we saw in 2022, in my mind, Sun Thunder is going to absolutely attract, no attention at the windows and have the best pace scenario that he's had really this year. So if you kind of look at the two races, the last two races, again, outside of the UAE Derby that were won in wire-to-wire fashion, he was part of two of those, right? So if you look, I think in the Southwest Stakes where Arabian Night won, as well as the Louisiana Derby, so definitely flattering front runners. Again, I just think that there's a strong case to be made for Sun Thunder in the underneath perspective. And, we may discuss him in a little more on a later video segment within the money, but just wanted to make sure that I throw that in.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's, when you're talking about Sun Thunder, the horse that comes to my mind. Now, granted, figure-wise, this horse I'm about to mention had a better profile, but it's a little bit like Giacomo, a horse that in his preps, was his form just looked very meh because he'd had, third, fourth, he'd had these efforts, but, the California preps that year were all run remarkably slowly, to favor front runners. And then he came to a Derby that was a giant pace collapse. Who knows, with all the talk about how paceless this year's Derby is, I mean, jockeys and their agents handicap too. If you end up having 3 or 4 horses going forward, hell bent for leather, thinking they're the one that's going to get it done. If jockeys get a little over enthused by the big moment and the 100,000 people screaming, I would never want to play a Derby where 0% of my tickets were for a pace collapse. Even a year like this, where I think it's probably going to flow to the front, having some alternative scenarios. I mean, Sun Thunder's a horse. The win pool is going to be weird this year, and long shots, we believe, are going to be bet down. But in an exotic pool, in exactas, in trifectas, in superfectas, that's a very interesting horse who's going to play like 75 to 1 or higher, I would think, in those pools. Do you think Sun Thunder can win this race, or is it more of a horse you would have for underneath, as we say, in those exotic bets?
Yeah, I think anytime you go on public record, if you will, and try to make a case for probably a horse that should be 40 or 50 to 1, then I probably would need to have something just for sanity insurance. But I think for the most part, I would categorize him as an underneath key, right? So, I do think some of the other horses are just a little bit better than him. But I do think, a lot of things going in his favor, including the jockey who could get, perhaps a ground saving trip, make a run. And again, even if the race is just evenly run, it would be a definite upgrade from a pace perspective relative to his last two. And the final thing that I'll say about the Risen Stars, first off, it's unfortunate that we have to watch replays in the dark, but I'm of the opinion that the horses coming out of that race specific, the top 3, I would definitely have a ticket that essentially boxes those 3. So, essentially Angel of Empire, Two Phils, and Sun Thunder. I think there's a world in which, that pays huge, if that's the exacta or the trifecta, but I'm definitely going to have one ticket that just sort of says, at least on the top end, that was one of the better preps that we saw all year. And I think all 3 of those horses are very live in the Kentucky Derby.
Very interesting idea to pick that one as the key form line. And that's also not a bad way to play a race like the Derby sometimes, is having different sets of tickets that might prioritize. Well, if it turns out that really was the fastest prep, and yeah, I mean, for $6 you could box those horses in the exacta and have a chance to potentially get an outsized payoff when so much of the money is going to be spread around in other places. Obviously, you could take a more serious swing at it as well, but for some of the more casual people listening, that's not a terrible idea as well. Anything else on this prep sheet, Tyler, before we move forward?
I think we can move on, right? And I think perhaps you're pulling up next, but if people want to get a ThoroPACE account, we do have a free account that you can still get. So inthemoneypodcast.com/ThoroPACE. So THOROPACE. So again, inthemoneypodcast.com /ThoroPACE. And, when you go there, I'll have some analysis. We'll continue to do some analysis, a forward-looking analysis, if you will, for the Kentucky Derby. We're also going to have a Kentucky Derby special. So most of our products are a subscription package, if you will, if you're a paying customer and want to get all of our data. However, for the Kentucky Derby, again, if you visit the link that you can see on the screen here, you can purchase the Kentucky Derby special, which would give you all of our data on Oaks and Derby Day, as well as some written analysis from our ThoroPACE team.
Oh, that's terrific. And obviously, over on the In the Money side, and I'll put that slide up in a minute. Going to have a lot more coverage, including our picks grid, which is always very popular, wagering strategies. While I pull that slide up, Tyler, why don't you tell folks about what you're going to do for that? Though before you do that, I'll just mention it one more time: www.inthemoneypodcast.com/ThoroPACE to get that amazing free info. And once again, ThoroPACE spelled ThoroPACE.
Yeah, so on the In the Money Plus side, right? Like I think we've kind of gotten in a pretty good rhythm the past couple of derbies, if you will, and so I think we'll have the picks grid, which is always a popular. We'll also have a wagering guide, so a couple of different betting budgets, if you will, so 250, 500, 1,000. We'll kind of walk through, what it is. A lot of it is analysis, and that's fine, but you have to be able to structure the wagers appropriately. So we take a lot of time in trying to map out a wager for those different budgets, and trying to accomplish different things. A few exclusive podcasts, right? So those are always popular, where we either look at the 2-day pick 6, the early pick 5. We'll have all of the great guests that you typically feature here. So JK will have some things. Drew Coatney, the last year's BCBC champ, will have some stuff. Frank Scatoni is always popular, and of course Nick Lemaire, as well as others. So I think the lineup is spectacular as always. Again, we've kind of refined where we've gotten and landed in terms of what we're producing and putting out. But we'll kick that off this weekend, where I will actually send out the speed figure heat map, right? So it's a popular visual where basically we're looking at the best figure earned for a lot of the popular services and trying to, position it and just say, are there any outliers? Are there anything that is interesting and can be gleaned from that? So that will start this weekend. But again, go to inthemoneypodcast.com/plus and get all of the Kentucky Derby wagering guides and strategies there.
Something I wanted to mention that I haven't even mentioned to you off air, it's sort of related to the heat map concept. We're going to do our Pro Player Roundtable a little bit differently this year due to the availability of Sean Borman and Paul Matisse. We're going to drop a free show this week at some stage where they go back through the preps again, sort of like we're doing here, but they're going to do it from a lens of the final figures and where their figures ended up relative to some of the more commercially available ones. They're not going to, there's going to be, you're still going to want the heat map on the plus side. It's not like they're going to be going through horse by horse or anything, but they'll be giving their opinions on what they think the key form lines should be. And yeah, we want you to support us through Plus. We think there's a lot of great extra content there, but there's also going to be an absolute ton of stuff for free in themoneypodcast.com. And I also want to remind folks about our live events we've been promoting. I should have thought to pop up a slide for this, but it'll all be in our free email newsletter, the links to the events we're doing Derby week. That's in themoneypodcast.com/email. Wednesday night in Lexington, Thursday night in Louisville, and then I'm doing a couple of events, smaller in-person events out at Chestnut Hall Farm as well on Tuesday and Thursday. Anyway, we're like a rock band. You can come see us if you're going down to the Derby, where we'll be going on tour. I want to take the last part of our time together today, Tyler, and I want to talk about the key question really in terms of, we've been looking back at what the paces have been. What about looking forward in what we think this year's Kentucky Derby pace might be? There's another video folks should check out on the network with Matt Bernier and I from Keeneland looking at the Derby pace. But I want to take a look at this going forward through the lens of your data. And I also want to encourage the folks watching the video to give us their thoughts on which runner is going to make the lead this year. Pop that in the comments down below. Let us know if you agree with our educated guesses here or have a thought of your own. But looking at the ThoroPACE data, first of all, for those that haven't seen it before, talk us through what these numbers mean on the screen. And then, Tyler, let's talk about who's going to make the lead in this year's Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, so we forced our forecast, if you will. So we create for every race a ThoroPACE forecast, and assuming that we have objective data for the runners, we can, basically assign the horses pace points, which you see in the far right here. So the blue negative numbers, those are kind of the late runners, the stretch runners, or quite honestly, just horses that are actually slow. So we'll talk through that, but ultimately all of those pace points and the number of horses factor in and the distance into ultimately what we call the pace forecast. So you can see at the top here, we have a plus 17. And there are a couple of things that probably need to be caveated with that, right? Like, so unfortunately, we just learned that Jace's Road got into the Derby. Haven't had a chance to update and put him in and take Blazing Sevens out. Blazing Sevens is one of the slowest horses from a pace perspective in the race. Jace's Road, one of the faster horses. It wouldn't surprise me, again, Dermisotogake aside, if he actually ends up being the pace points leader from the American contingent that we would have data. So what I personally, again, just, having used this data for a while, is I think we moved from that first band of red to that second band of red, probably in a plus 24 to 25, which again, that doesn't mean total meltdown, but it does mean that the stretch runners should get fair run in this. Basically, when we look through the specific runners, again, the pace points are to the right. We see the last two races and the pace figure that the races that they were in that was earned there, right? So we already talked about a couple. Tapit Trice, right? So that was a blue-coated race in the bluegrass. He was able to overcome that. Minus 14 and win. Conversely, Kingsbarns, the Louisiana Derby we had as minus 26. And you can see that Kingsbarns is actually, is a double, pace advantage situation, right? So a double downgrade, if you want to think of it in that respect. Another one that we discussed briefly was Confidence Game. So got a plus 28. Again, that red box may go away as the pace it gets fast, because we're always trying to put it in the context of today's race. So if he is going to get that same setup, and we're moving closer to that with Jace's Road, I would say, as well as our projection that we've expected to make on Dermisotogake, I think that red box, it wouldn't surprise me if that goes away. Still not a horse that I like. I don't like the layoff particularly. And then, again, the only other thing that I would say, again, to put a finer point on it, is Dermisotogake. I think everyone saw the UAE Derby. He's, got a lot of support, appears to be training well, liking the Churchill Downs surface. In watching some of the replays, I don't think it's a horse that necessarily needs to be on the lead.
Right.
I think it's definitely a horse that has the speed to be on the lead. So I think that the leader of the Kentucky Derby at this point, from what I can tell, is either going to be Dermisotogake verifying, which actually might surprise some people, or Jace's Road. So I think that Brad Cox, ultimately early is going to have a pretty big say in how this race, or at least the horses from his barn. Obviously, that's not going to do any it's going to do favors, if you will, the faster they go early for his other horse, and perhaps his main horse, and that's Angel of Empire, who, again, if he gets a good setup, I'm pretty confident that he will be running on late.
Looking at this, I'm thinking this is going to be, I'm just going to call it a truly run race, where hopefully, the pace doesn't dictate the outcome so much as it just allows whoever the fastest horse on the day is to get the job done. I think before looking at this data, I was thinking it was going to be maybe a little bit more on the slow side, but especially, seeing how a horse like Verifying shapes up on your numbers, the Jace's Road data, the knowing that, we don't have Dermisotogake's numbers in here, obviously having run overseas, but knowing that he's a horse with speed, I feel like truly run race is the best guess. How about you? How would you describe your prediction for what the pace is going to be and who it might favor?
Yeah, I could completely agree, right? Like I feel like that, hopefully the best horse and the horse that runs the best race, trips aside, right, has a chance with this pace scenario. So I think that's what we're looking at this year. And, I think that part of anytime you have a 20 horse field, right, like theoretically you're going to have at least an honest pace. I also think that there's a couple of other elements that enter into this, right? When you have horses like Authentic, Medina Spirit that go, essentially wire to wire. Well, some of that is the fact that they were in honestly run races. They were just the best horse on the day at that distance, right? So that's another factor, right? Like some of these horses are just not, they're going to struggle the last furlong or so in this race. And that can, if you take traffic trouble out of that equation, a forwardly placed horse, probably has a theoretical advantage. So
one other point on the pace I want to talk about is Dermisotogake, and specifically his rider Lemaire, who got involved in that pace duel last year. I don't see him making that, mistake again. I feel like if other horses are going hammer and tongs for the lead, he's much more likely to sit. As we know from his tape, Dermisotogake, not a one-way speed runner. And in a way, and the draw will give us much more information on this. With the right draw, I'm pretty confident Dermisotogake is going to get the right trip. What is your analysis of him? Where do you think he's going to be early? Do you agree with me that Lemaire, having been on a speedy runner last year, might give him a little bit more of a chance to get the better kind of trip this time around?
Yeah, I do think draw might force the hand one way or the other there. But I will say, as someone that made a pretty strong case, I felt like for Crown Pride last year, definitely didn't like him being part of one of the faster paces, definitely in recent memory. I agree with you, right? Like I feel like the horse also has a style that he's definitely not a need the lead type. So I think anytime you have speed, it's probably wise to use it. But you don't want to use it at all costs, right? So I think, as we spoke to, or you highlighted a little bit earlier, these jockeys, these connections do a little bit of handicapping, and I think that they're all going to sense that the more forward they are, probably the better. Again, you don't want to take a horse completely out of his running style. If you have a dead closer and you all of a sudden decide to sin, that may get the horse uncomfortable. I don't think we're going to see any of that, but those horses that have shown a preference to be forward, I think, they're going to have every right to run their race and, do as well as they possibly can on the day.
Good stuff. For much more from Tyler, sign up for inthemoneypodcast.com/plus. You're also going to want to get your free ThoroPACE account if you don't have it already. That one, inthemoneypodcast.com/ThoroPACE, ThoroPACE. You'll have final answers and much more from us if you stick with all of our content. Please rate, review, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We appreciate the comments. Who do you think is going to be in the lead? But yeah, I think we've pretty much covered it, Tyler, unless you have a closing thought for the audience before we get out of here.
That's it. We're 2 weeks away, and I can't wait.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Can't wait to get down there, back to the bluegrass. And thank you so much for joining us for this special video. Keep checking back the channel. I think we're going to have stuff, pretty much every day this week. Some really pointed handicapping forward stuff, some fun stuff as well. Check it out. And also, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. In the Money Media, the place to go. For Tyler Wisman, I'm Peter Thomas Fornatal. May you win all your photos.